Oh, we have a hand up.
Pinkish, you got a question? Okay. All right. So talking about presentations, persuasive presentation. So this fits into this our change analytics series here. So you can see the other ones that we've got. Later on this month, we'll be talking about communicating change with empathy. And in here in particular around doing that for this idea of going back to the office and how we're going to go take that on. So more about that later this month. But what we want to do today and talk about today is a little bit about visual perception. So like, how does this actually work? Why do we even care about this whole visualization thing at all? And then in particular around the data piece of it. So I want to talk about data visualization, maybe some insights for you about how to think about it and what would be some of the visualizations that would be particularly useful. And then we'll get into the story part of it. And this is really where the persuasive part of a persuasive presentation is gonna come in. So, you know, you've heard this before, right? Our big idea around here, certainly not our big idea, is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And you guys know that and experience it, I'm sure, because, you know, it can be so much faster to take that on. And that's because of this idea around how a visual perception system works, right? There, depending on the estimate that you look at, as much as a quarter to a third of the human brain can be wrapped around being able to take on visual information and really kind of capture that sort of visual information. So humans are wired that way, right? Or we're wired to take things in visually. And so the extent we can do that, we want to try and make that happen. And that's because of an example just like this, right? So humans can see much faster than it can analyze. So if I were to give you this this kind of setup of a bunch of data just like this and asked you to tell me what was going on in it, eventually you'd be able to get in there and do it, right? You would figure it out, but it would take a while. But if I went and I spent time and put it together so that you could see it like this, well, now you know a lot and right away, right? So you can tell the difference between a fast rising company and a slower rising company. You know, even just the ranges right away, right? That we're talking about $0 to 250 million, and you know the time spans that we're talking about, and you see the fast ones are happening within 10 years, where the slower ones are out to 20 plus years for some of them in order to get to the same level of revenue growth that the other companies are getting. And you get all that within seconds, way faster actually than what it took me to even say it to you all, because how rapidly the human mind can take on visual information and be able to process it. So let me give you another example. So I'll throw this up and I'll just give you a few seconds to ponder what this thing is telling you. And if you can read and write French, it'll go even faster, which is also a hint. Should have like music playing underneath this. I have to add that in.
Yes, for a fact.
All right. So for those of you who are not history buffs, this is a depiction of Napoleon's march on Moscow. And so the tan line is both a description of where the army went as it traversed the geography, right? So it's actually, you can see cities and rivers that are depicted there. But the width of that line indicates how many men were in Napoleon's army. And you can see as Napoleon goes from west to east that that line is getting more and more narrow because his army is getting smaller. And then the black line is Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. And you can see there again, it's getting even smaller. And the reason for that is depicted here, and that's on the bottom. And you can see on the bottom there, it's a temperature graph. So those are temperatures, and those are temperatures in Celsius, right? So those minuses on the front of the numbers, that is really cold, unbelievably cold. And the impact of that on Napoleon's army was to decimate it. So it wasn't through battle losses that this occurred. the Russians did what they had done for centuries. They simply retreated further and further east into the country, drawing whoever the invading force is further and further into the country, depriving them of supplies. And as a result of that, those armies are decimated by the weather. And that's all pulled together here. And I put this up because this came out soon after this campaign occurred, this failure of a campaign for Napoleon. So this is, decades, over a century before computers were around. This is hand drawn, put together, but it's a great example of a lot of information compactly put together that can tell a pretty complete story about what was going on with an incident. And again, it took me way longer to tell you all about it than it would have taken you to just pull it all in yourself. If you could have read the title in French, that would have helped quite a bit. But you get an idea of the kind of thing that you're able to put together. And so I love this quote from Florence Nightingale: to affect through the eyes what we fail to convey to the public through their word-proof ears. Word-proof is an awesome phrase. So Florence Nightingale, also an important historical figure, also related to conflict in that part of the world. So this is a few decades later, and it's the Crimea campaign. Florence Nightingale is part of the British forces that are there. She was a nurse and sent there to try and literally clean up one of the major hospitals that was there. And what she found was that simply by cleansing the place, you were able to reduce the amount of disease. But she proved that through statistics and through a visualization process. So in addition to being a nurse, and you may also know that she was a social reformer when she came back to England, but she was also a statistician, and I mean a for real statistician. She was the first female fellow of the British Statistical Society, and she was also a member of the American Statistical Society. And it was because of her work in healthcare that she was able to gain entrance, because of what she was able to do that was so powerful in both the stats itself as well as in the visual depiction. And again, this is back in the 19th century, so these are hand-drawn depictions about what is going on. But she was able to have that kind of an impact to make change because of the stats and the data visualization that she was doing. So I've said this word data visualization a whole bunch of time. So let's talk about data visualization and what we're really talking about here, why we want to do this, and what's really underlying this kind of work. So the originator of what would be considered modern data visualization is Edward Tufte, and he wrote this book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, back in the early 80s. And his notion was that a visualization should reveal the data. So Edward Tufte was a significant pioneer here in that he laid out a lot of the initial ideas. And so he was advocating for showing the data in terms of thinking about trends and comparisons, so that you're pushing whoever is looking at it to really think about what the substance of this is, and not think about the methodology. And it's wrapped around this idea of comparison, because the eye, the human visual system, is very good at comparing. It's actually not particularly good at being quantitative. So looking at something and saying, oh, that is 2.5 centimeters long, or the richness of the red of that color is this value. But it's very good at saying this red is darker than that red, and this line is longer than that line. And so that qualitative, comparative kind of thing goes very well, works very well in the human visual system. And so you want to use that. What he was advocating was to use that in a data visualization and encourage people to compare. So what were some of his recommendations? Well, he first recommended, somewhat way ahead of his time, pre-read. So distribute the materials ahead of time so that people could take 5 to 10 minutes to really understand what's going on. And that has certainly gotten quite a bit of a resurgence in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, somewhat famously with Amazon. So Amazon doesn't push PowerPoints out anymore. They write memos. And put the data in the memos, and you come into the meeting, it's not sent out ahead. You sit in the meeting all together and read the material for the first 10, 20 minutes or so of the meeting, and then have the discussion. So if they have very much embraced this idea of taking this on first individually. And the idea around that is the second thing, that there's a self-discovery that occurs, that viewers are able to really understand the trends in the data and make their own assessment, as opposed to being told this is what the trends are, and then the data is a backup. It's the other way around. The data and the visualization come first, and then you're able to understand what is in there on your own, mostly around this idea of comparison. So it's a comparative visualization, so you can see what's really going on. And then that sparks the discussion. Because if I put it in front of you and I'm honest about it, I'm revealing the data, as Tufte suggested that we do, then you might come up with a different conclusion than I might come up with, as opposed to I slap the data visualization on, and then on the header, I say what the answer is. Now I've anchored you. So I've created a bias, essentially, that you are now biased towards my answer, and it's going to be much more difficult for you to come up with your own insight into that, because I've told you what the answer is, and so anchored you on my answer, which is not necessarily the way in which we're going to drive useful thinking about what's going on here. So this is, I'll give you a moment here to take a look. Here's an example. Think of this as a 5-question survey that may have gone out as part of a change initiative, talking about readiness for a transition for a new CEO. And just take a few seconds and see what it is that you can learn. Okay, so you can look at some things, and in terms of color, if you look at question 3, that pops as being the only one that has any not at all answers to it. Question 1 has got a lot of the mostly, it's got that big green. 4 and 5 have more of the definitely's, the bigger piece of blue. So you can learn a bunch of stuff in there, but it's not very good in the quantitative part. In fact, I had to write those labels in and give you the quantitative piece above it. Mm-hmm. So it's not super awesome for comparison because of the way that it's laid out. But if I take the exact same data and then lay it out like this, so I reformat the chart, hoping to reveal the data, well, a couple things pop out right away. So one is not everybody answered all the questions, which is almost impossible to see in the pie chart view of it. You'd have to look above at all the actual numbers, add them up in your head to figure it out. But here you look at it, you see it immediately. Like questions 2 and 3 have data that's not as long as the other 3 questions. And so not as many people answered those questions. And so that there's not as much of that data in there. You can also see the comparison across the bars much better than you could otherwise. So you can see the big long orange bar at the bottom and compare that to the longer ones. You could see where the greatest number of somewhats are in question 2 right away, because you can see it and pull that in visually. So when we're trying to do a comparison, you want to think about how are you constructing the chart, the visualization, so that it makes that comparison as good as possible. And so I would say a series of 5 pie charts doesn't do nearly as good a job as a series of 5 stacked bar charts, which is what this is. So Google has some pretty good rules that kind of dovetail into all of this. So I want to pull theirs in as well. It's their rubric that they use for judging is something going to be good or not. And whether you're digging Google or not, these are actually interesting to take on and think about for yourself, right? So one is this idea of be honest, make sure that the data and the accuracy and the integrity of all that come first, and be careful about not distorting or confusing that information. And then once you're sure that you got the right stuff in there, make sure you're helping the viewer out, right? So provide some context so that it makes it easier to navigate the data. Like, where did it come from? How many people did you talk to if you did a survey? Not just putting the answers in, but giving the fuller context with it all. And then number 3, if you can, delight the user. And what they mean by that is, are you giving them something they actually see, right? If you want to think about it like this, don't be boring, right? Because why are you putting the visualization up if there isn't really anything to discover as a result of it, unless that's actually what you want people to know is, hey, this data is boring and there isn't anything interesting to know about it. But I wouldn't show a lot of those because you're going to start losing people pretty quickly. if you start to think about 4, helping to provide some clarity of focus, so where to focus, that's where color comes in and the right line style can come in, and that all helps with understanding. And then being, I would say, cautious around scale. So one of the things that I find difficult and try and get out of my students' repertoire of things is to truncate the scale. If you've ever seen these scales where the data goes, let's say from 0 to 100, and most of the data is in the 90s, and then people will truncate the scale and just show from 90 to 100. Well, that exaggerates the amount of variation that's in there. But if you put it back on its full scale, that may essentially look like more or less a flat line. So it can be misleading to use scale in that way. Now, there could be value in that. And if that's the appropriate context to do it, that's great. But again, are you trying to reveal the data, or are you driving a particular point of view? And then lastly, structure. And so that's things like if there's any sort of hierarchy in there, make sure that you understand that. You want this to all be as intuitive as possible and people to be able to pull it in on their own. All right, so what I want to do now is like get to some actual data visualization. And I'm going to refer back to this whole notion, try and map these back to this notion of going back to the office and how to think about that and what might be helpful for that, how to do that in a helpful way, and what might be problematic around that. And we're going to talk about these 8 different chart types as ways to think about this. And so I'm going to ask you guys to sort of play along on this too. There is a stamp function in Zoom. And so if you go up to the top where you see that view options thing and hover your cursor over it, then you should get the pop-out that you see over there. And I want you to go to the annotate section. And if you do, then you'll get into this bar that's right here. You see this bar of possibilities. And right over here where this yellow line is where the stamp functionality is. And so I want you to go in there and find your favorite stamp and just practice for me real quick. Put some stars, there's question marks on there. You have arrows, so make sure you're good. At this point, I'm sure you're all Zoom ninjas, so I probably don't need to actually show you how to do all this. So we've been doing it for forever. But just wanted to check and make sure, because we want to use this as a way to vote on these items that we've got here. So hopefully you've made your choice. I'm going to ask you guys to stop now, and I'm going to remove your beautiful artwork and then ask you to use it for me on the following pages. All right, so if you had mostly continuous data, so that means data that moves all the way through, so not integers 1, 2, 3, 4, but like height, which has gradations of values to it. And you also want to show those changes through time. Which of these charts would you use? If you just put a stamp on your favorite chart that you think would be useful if you had data like this. All right, excellent. The answers are in. You guys have been reading the right stuff or doing the right things, or I don't know what's going on, but very good. So yeah, you want to use a line chart like that. You want to, you can have things that are area charts as well. A waterfall chart in this case might also be valuable. You see some of the other ones that are here. So you want to, if it's something where you're going to show through time, so time is likely going to be on the horizontal axis, so time increases as you go from left to right. Then having the whatever is in the chart vary above that is now going to be able to give you good information, and because you're using a line, that helps you to show the continuity, that the data is actually continuous, and so that makes it better as a result of that. And then use color and shape to do some differentiation, right? So color might be help certain values pop, shape might be, okay, I got some different series in here. So this looks at one thing, this looks at something else that I want to compare, and I'm doing them both through time. So if I was thinking about this idea of going back to the office, one of the things you keep hearing about is, well, we're going back to the office because we can be more collaborative and then more productive as a result of that. So if I wanted to prove that, maybe I want to show amounts of interactions that are going on. and how those change through time. I would need to have that data, obviously, to be able to do that, but I would want to show that. Productivity is another thing that keeps coming up. That I find productivity to be somewhat problematic, and that not everybody always has a measure of productivity. They have a gut tummy feel for it, but if you had that, then you'd be able to show that through time. One thing I did hear from a CEO that Roxanne and I talked to was he looked at amount of login time for his people in his company, both before and after they had gone home. And what he found was that, not surprisingly, people were logged on more and productive. Like, it wasn't just logged into the system, but they were working, or something was going on with their computer. And that was happening later in the evening, earlier in the morning, and on weekends. And so he generally thought the company was doing fine in terms of its ability to do the sort of work it was doing before, but productivity was actually going down, right? Because people were spending more time to get the same work done. That's less productive. So he could tell from that his team was under stress, that something bad was happening, and he was worried about the longevity of that and how to take that on. So that's an interesting way to think about this from the point of view of how do you want to handle that, and does that inform you in any way on how to use the office? That would be an example of something that's time-based like that. All right, so let's take a look at this. What if the data is discrete? So now it is like integers, like you're counting something as an example, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you want to categorize it, and you want to be able to compare each of the categories. Which of these charts would you use? It's not quite as clear this time around. People could tell that was not so hot on the pie chart, so they're not picking that. All right, so in this one, what I would tell you is doing a bar chart is going to help you out with it. As we saw in the example, the pie charts make it really difficult to do the comparison part of this. So when you try and get in there and make a comparison, that can be almost impossible to do in some cases. But using these stacked bar charts would be the first place that I would go, because then I get to show comparison. I can stack different categories of things together to show that. The other one that those in the US, or if you're following the US election, would have seen is this one on the bottom, this parallel coordinates chart. And so that is showing the number of votes, or an example would be to use that to show the number of votes through time. And so you can actually see as something changed. You're counting up the votes, and you get to see how the categories change as it moves through time. So that's an interesting way to show that particular kind of information here. But you're really trying to do this at the category level. And again, this is helping for the idea of comparison to occur. And so that makes it much easier to happen as a result of that. You can, a subset of these is the ranking chart. This is really the same idea, you're just putting them in order. And so an ordered chart like this, biggest, smallest, shortest to tallest, whatever you're looking to do is going to be a useful way to do that. And that's really good for this whole Pareto rule where you're trying to show 80-20. So like I've used these as an example in showing sales of products, which typically 80% of the revenue that you're going to get is going to come from 20% of your products, and sometimes can be even sharper, 90% of the revenue from 10% of the products. And that becomes quite evident in an ordered chart like this. All right, so now if you had all discrete data, but you wanted to show the comparison of the part to the whole, now which one would you use? All right, excellent work. Yes, so here, as much as I don't like pie charts, and I've been good this time around, I haven't railed on them as much as I usually do. And I do actually tell my students no pie charts, because they're mostly misused. But this is the one place where they show up and can be really useful. So they're really good for comparing one element to an entire whole. And so whether you use a pie chart or a donut chart, it doesn't really matter. What's interesting about a donut chart is you can put information in the center to kind of help make that happen. But this is also where things like a tree map shows up, which is the one on the bottom left. And so the area of each part of the tree shows the amount of whatever the thing is. And a sunburst is essentially doing the same thing. It's just oriented now into a circle. And if I was thinking about going back to the office and I wanted to understand what people were doing with their day, this might be a way to show that. So maybe I want to know how much time they're spending in meetings, or I might even break it down further. How much time are you spending in update meetings versus a brainstorm meeting versus a strategy meeting? How much time are they spending being able to actually get work done on their own? How much time are they collaborating to get work done? So maybe I come up with 5 or 6 different things. And if I was tracking that and I wanted to see the difference, maybe I never did it before, but I start tracking that now, maybe pulling information off of the calendar apps that my team is using, and then use that as a monitoring technique for what I want to do as we go back to the office, and see, is that changing? Is it changing in the way that I want it to change? I'll just bounce through a few more of these. So a correlation chart, this is really getting into statistical sorts of things. So now I really want to show the data points down at the bottom. And there's where something like a heat map is going to come in, where I'm able to make a comparison and show things across different levels and then colorize that so that I can see what's happening in the heat map. A distribution chart, again, is a statistical data analysis chart. Now I'm essentially counting up how many times values are happening in a particular area. So that's exactly what a histogram is. So if I did a histogram of height of people, I would get that kind of nice bell-shaped where I won't get the numbers right, but I think common, at least US male, is 5'8", and then getting taller and taller will start, the numbers would go off as you go to the right, and getting shorter, the numbers would go off as you go to the left. I could do that with a box and whisker chart, which is to the right. It's essentially the same thing. So as if I'm looking at the histogram from the top down. So I'm just reorienting the data. So I see where the main part of the data is, and then I see the whiskers as they go off. So I can see the range of the data, but also see where the bulk of it is clumped together. So it does useful things, like it tells me about where the outliers are. So it's easier for me to see where there's an outline point. So if you look at my example over here with the box and whisker chart, you see this little guy sitting out here. That would get lost if I was doing some of the other charts that were there. Certainly if I had a pie chart, you wouldn't see anything because there wouldn't even be a line because it wouldn't show up. But at least here I could see, oh, there's this dot that's hanging out in space out to the side. So if you got a large data set, this is a good way to get people oriented to that. Flowcharts, anyone that's done anything around a project certainly knows what a Gantt chart looks like and what that is coming together with that. What I showed you with Napoleon's March is this idea of a Sankey chart. It shows the flow of things. And you can get interesting network charts and things like that that are in here. And it's useful for showing transmission of information. And then also useful for showing movement. So it can be useful for this whole, I want to see connections through time. So as an example, I might look at, if I really want to know about productivity, and I want to see the difference of that between people working at home versus people working in the office, I might take a look at how often people are making connections to other people. So maybe I'd look at the email data and how often they're emailing back and forth. Or I might look at Slack data if you're using a tool like that, and how often people are making those kinds of connections. And then even more so, I might look at the density of that, like how much information is actually being passed. And you can do all of this off of those tools. We actually talk about some of these, like how to do that with some of these things in the change analytics concentration that Roxanne and I do. It's sort of an expansion, or it is an expansion of all of this, and gets into analytics and how to manage data. You can do those things with these kinds of tools. And then again, see the difference between how things are going for your company now versus you go back to the office and what's happened. Because there's this idea that going back to the office is going to make us better and more productive. At least that seems to be espoused by some leaders, a lot of leaders. Seems to have the opposite idea if you look at the survey data that's out there right now about what employees want to do. And then lastly in here, a relationship chart. And this kind of takes the only new one in here is this Venn diagram where we're looking at sets of things and trying to understand where the overlap is. And this is just helping you pull all those pieces together. The bulk of all of this, though, that we're really trying to drive to is what Tufte came up with. And so what we want to do is we want to start off with a question. If you really want to do this well, you have a hypothesis or a question that you want to answer, and you're putting the data visualization together in order to answer that. And so you come up with a comparison view and make sure that you pare it down, only including what you need to be able to tell the story. So on the right-hand side is a map, obviously, that you can see here, and you see little black lines. What this is depicting is a area of London. And the person that put this together was Dr. Snow. Back in the 19th century, he was working in a hospital in London and dealing with a cholera outbreak. And at the time, it was thought that cholera was airborne. And so the advice was to close your doors and windows and stay inside, which wouldn't have worked, or get out of London and go out to the country to the fresh air, which actually would have worked, but not for the reasons that they thought. And what Dr. Snow did was actually plot where the people lived who were getting sick. And the length of the bar indicates the number of people at that particular address. And as he plotted it, and as you guys can clearly see here, those bars are not all over London. They're in this relatively tight area of London. And what they discovered is the commonality is that all the people there were getting their water from the same well. And that well had cholera. And that's when it was discovered that cholera was actually waterborne. And it turns out the cholera is actually relatively easy to treat as long as you know what it is and know who has it. And then fixing the problem becomes more direct as well, because you're trying to fix this well as opposed to just telling people to run away from the disease. So you actually go do something. And so this is really the first example that I've been able to find of the transmission of a disease and how to take on a disease being discovered through data visualization. And this is the example you see here. So if you don't remember anything else about what I've talked about, just remember this word compare. If you pull things together so you're able to make a comparison, then that will be valuable for you. All right, so the last couple ideas I want to give to you, and then I'm curious what you guys have on your own mind, is how to go about telling the story. And the thing I want to highlight for you is to beware of this idea of the narrative fallacy. If you haven't heard this before, it shows up in this book that I've shown here, The Black Swan. And you can see the description from Nassim Taleb. Think of the world around you laden with trillions of details and try to describe it, and you'll find yourself tempted to weave a thread into what you are saying. A novel, a story, a myth, or a tale, all have the same function. They spare us from the complexity of the world and shield us from its randomness. And the notion there is that this is a natural functioning of the human brain. Right, that you naturally try and pull these things together and create a story to help you to understand. That's where myths come from, and there's certainly lots of other things that wrap around that. And so what we want to do is we're using data visualization to help us to break this so that we don't fall into this trap and become stuck with it. And what I would really hope for all of you to do is anytime that you're putting together your story, you're thinking about these three things. What do I want people to know? What do I want them to do? And how do I want them to feel? So if we're thinking about this from the point of view of going back to the office, let's say you're picking up to do this in a hybrid way. I want you to know that we're going to do this as a hybrid setup. I want you to choose when you're going to be in and when you're going to be at home based on where you think you're going to be the most productive. And I want you to feel confident that this is going to work out well for you. You have the tools to be able to go make it happen. So I would then try and wrap my data visualization around how to convey that, because this is where you're going to be able to move then and drive action. All of this for us, for Roxanne and I, is always wrapped around this idea of the impact that change has on culture, what we call joy at work. And the change done well can drive joy at work in a positive direction, and a change done poorly can do the opposite. I'm sure you guys have been both fortunate and unfortunate to be on both ends of those. We think this go back to the office thing is really set up to be something to be done incredibly poorly. Is what we've seen so far from people is a drive to just do it from leaders without a lot of real clear communication, and that puts them on the path to reducing joy at work. And so things like trust, the very first one of the 10 dimensions on there, is going to get stomped on when leaders are kind of driving it that way. However, we do think it is possible to grow joy at work, increase and strengthen the culture by doing it well, but you're going to have to craft your plan to go do that. Telling the story well with data visualization to create a persuasive presentation is going to be part of that. And so we continue to do research around this. So just highlight that for all of you. And we have a bunch of what we've written on our website, and it's there for free, and you're certainly welcome to go grab it. So please do that and consume some of that stuff, because we're trying to keep that fresh and out there as we discover it. And then the last thing is I just wanted to highlight that we do have a change analytics concentration that we've just redone, like literally in the last couple of weeks, completely redone it. And it's out there, it's available immediately. So we have all kinds of recorded information and tools that are on the site. But in addition to that, we also do live sessions every other month. The next one is coming up in September on the 17th. It's in the two parts, as you see, a little bit in the morning, take a break, a little bit in the afternoon. And the whole series covers these things around choose, collect, analyze, and finally present the data. So we go into more depth around this than what we've done. The live session is a simulation. So we're going to do all of these things in that live session. So you actually get to go try it out and exercise all the stuff that's in there. And this is part of the 3 classes that you see on the left-hand side. They're all wrapped around what we do with change management. All right. So with that, I want to say thank you. And here's how you guys can get in touch with us. But if you have any questions, we would love to hear what's on your mind. You can just come off mute or throw something in the chat, whatever works for you guys. Nothing? All right.
Crickets.
Crickets. Okay, guys. Well, we are around if you ever want to reach out to us, got some thoughts about what's going on. Always happy to hear what is on your mind. Send us an email or go ahead and just contact us directly. That's fine as well. I see lots of people stamping things. So I don't know if you're trying to come off mute or you guys are trying to add beautiful artwork to
I want to do that too.
what's going on. So let me see. I can't unmute anybody, but I can only mute people. Deborah, did you have something? I saw you unmute for a second and I'll go back. If you want to get rid of the stamping, you got to go back up to annotate and click on the little red X that's up there, and that'll take you out of annotate mode.
Oh, if you're talking, we can hear you.
All right.
There you
Yes.
Now can you hear me?
are.
Beautiful.
We gotcha.
Okay. Here's my question. And I was late coming in because I had problems getting into the webinar. Then I saw the second email, so I was able to get in.
Good.
Here's the thing. All of these various charts, what software do you recommend to be able to get these various charts?
I should have said that. So I made all of these in Excel, Deborah. So
These were all in Excel.
yeah, they're all out of the box from Excel.
Okay, because I
So you could go into the there are a couple packages in Excel that you may have to turn on. They're all part of the main license. You have to go through the options part and actually turn some of these things on, but they're all there. What I used was a Microsoft 365 standard out of the box, not at all fancy version of Excel to make all of these. I just put them in our pretty colors so they all look the same, but otherwise they're standard stuff.
okay, good, thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, glad to help you out with that. All right, folks, anything else? Other thoughts or questions? All right, well, we are, as always, glad to be able to talk with all of you. Please stay in touch and come see us in a couple weeks for our next webinar. We talk about communicating change, about going back to the office and doing that with empathy. All right, everyone, take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.